Same old man. Here's Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for December 23rd, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. We hope everyone had a great holiday.
Indeed.
Celebrating with your family and friends and eating all kinds of food and desserts, whatever you do to celebrate.
Lots of alcohol.
Lots of alcohol for some.
Which
yes.
we don't endorse, but I have to admit it was a bit of a rough one for me because I actually went almost this whole month without drinking, so my body wasn't accustomed to it. So just having there are a few beers or just a few small glasses of bourbon didn't really sit well. Just goes to show how old I'm getting, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's definitely where I'm at in my life as well. I do not drink all that often, and mostly it's because of how busy I am. Even if I wanted to partake, it's hard to find the time.
I feel like there are only really two occasions you drink more than you don't, and that's either a Michigan football game in some way or the Oscars. It's usually one of the two.
The Oscars is mandatory. There's no doubt about it. I could not get through a ceremony without drinking. So that is absolutely the biggest day of the year for me drinking wise.
What about the Globes? Do you drink during that at all?
Yeah, I don't get quite as crazy with the Globes, but ironically, I guess, because everyone
I was going to say,
seems to get all kinds of loopy with their alcohol and food intake there.
Yeah, I feel like if there's any televised award show to drink during, the primary one would be the Golden Globe, so I find that interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never really thought about it, so I'm just spitballing here, but maybe it has something to do with how silly the Globes is inherently. And
that's a good point. And sometimes with recent histories, I guess we can say, at least recent telecasts of the Oscars, there tends to be more of a likelihood that something is going to go wrong, right?
Yeah.
To have a little bit of liquid courage when you see the whole Moonlight La La Land debacle, or what happened a few years ago with Anthony Hopkins winning Best Actor saved for last, and it wasn't Chadwick Boseman. Having a little bit of alcohol in you, I think, kind of makes sense for that. Like, there's more opportunities for the Oscars to do silly things. So I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and overall, I feel like that ceremony is taking itself much more seriously. So the tone of it is very different, but there's still a level of awkwardness to it. And that, like, those jarring tones make for an uncomfortable watch for me. So, like, the only way for me to get through it is to, loosen up a little bit.
Loosen up a little bit. Yeah, loosen it up.
And
I get it.
A little bit, I mean a lot of it. And especially because it's a long ceremony.
And it sucks
really
it's on
long.
a Sunday. We all have to go to work the next day.
It should be a national holiday.
It really should be, yeah.
But speaking of, we just celebrated one.
We did, yeah.
And we hope everyone had a great time. And of course, we are continuing the festive spirit here as we talk about Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest.
Oh, what a holiday movie.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. That is for sure.
The Zone of Interest. Watching this movie, JD, my first thought was, that would be a cool name for a podcast. The Zone of Interest.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
If we ever have a name change, it'll be that. Well,
hopefully it's not patented and we have to, seek approval from Glazer himself.
Yeah. No, it is a great name. It's an interesting premise. It's very Jonathan Glazer-y. And of course, as everyone has pointed out, this is his first film since 2014 when Under the Skin graced our presence in theaters. So it's great to have him back.
Yeah.
And in Glazer fashion, he, comes at us with something that is We'll say provocative.
It, it's going to get people to talk.
It's going to get people to talk. That is for sure.
The fact that his movie Sexy Beast is the one that stimulates the least conversation is saying something.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, and I love how he's able to provoke in a way that is genuinely thoughtful. I mean, we can sit here and joke about it.
Yeah.
And honestly, bringing humor to this setting is almost mandatory. It's necessary because this material is so dark and bleak
Yeah.
that you have to bring levity where you can just to cope with it and not find yourself drinking for the wrong reasons.
Oh, yeah. We don't want depression to hit us during this episode.
So, yeah, but that's, why we love Jonathan Glazer.
Absolutely.
He's always fascinating. This was on my top 10 most anticipated back in January. And I want to say that was the case for it last year because this was supposed to come out last year, I believe, if I remember correctly.
I think so. I'd have to double check the In Session Film archives with that, but this is one that I think was meant to come out last year. I think you're right.
Yeah, I'm almost positive that's the case. Maybe even a couple of years. I don't really know. But it finally comes out this year, and I'm excited to dive into it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into The Zone of Interest, written and directed by the aforementioned Jonathan Glazer, and it stars Christian Friedel and Sandra Hüller as our primary two characters that we'll focus on for this conversation. There's certainly a few that come and go throughout the film that I'm sure we'll mention. If you're not familiar with The Zone of Interest, this is about the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hulse, and his wife Hedwig, as they strive to build a dream life for their family in a house and garden next to the camp. Okay, so there it is. I think it's also worth noting that this is very loosely adapted from a novel.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, because I haven't read the novel.
Same here.
Glazer seemingly reshifted so much of what came from the novel to tell this story. So it sounds like this is mostly, I don't want to say original, but it's like his own movie. There's very little that he pulls from the novel. It's the same premise, but a very different story.
I think what he does, I believe what he does is, and again, for those who read the novel, or at least those who are more familiar with the novel can correct us if we're wrong, but I think it's there that he kind of plays a bit more with perspective, which is a big thing that this movie does. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as what this film is, suggesting about perspective in all of this.
Yeah, and not only did he throw out most of what's in the novel in terms of not just perspective, but plotting, and the way everything is structured. But in the novel, they use fictional names, which is something that Glazer also subverts here. He does not mimic that. He is using, as I just noted there in the synopsis, he brought back the real names of these people.
Yeah. So there is a level of history here.
There is, absolutely. All right. With that laid out, let's jump into it. Brendan, what did you think about The Zone of Interest?
I will admit, just preface this review by saying that I'm very fresh on this movie. I only just watched this maybe a few hours ago. And this is definitely one I want to sit with. So if it sounds like I'm not as in love with this movie as most others, it's probably because I just haven't been able to mine everything from it yet. And that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation. Because I think at the very least, if it doesn't end up being one of my favorite films of the year, it is perhaps my favorite experiment of the year. And one of the things that this film does, and it's very top of mind, it's very common knowledge for a lot of people who have either seen it, who are promoting it. It's not in the plot synopsis you laid out there, but the quote unquote gimmick of this movie is the perspective it chooses to showcase from. That being, it's a Nazi perspective. It's an evil perspective. And not only that, as a Holocaust movie, it's all about what we hear and sense as opposed to what we see. So it's a very interesting experiment and a very interesting idea. And how violence can be portrayed in cinema, because this is a very violent movie. We just don't really see any of it, but we always know it's there, and it does give off a very chilling and harrowing quality. Like, this is a very chilling film for that reason. And being a Jonathan Glazer film, he is very much stimulating conversation about how this setting and this perspective is ultimately shaped in an apathetic way around evil, and how this family is pretty much unfazed by the unrelenting evil that is happening just over the wall right next to them. And
Yeah.
it's a very harrowing idea, especially when you see children playing in the backyard and they use the greenhouse as a quote unquote gas chamber as a form of playtime. Like, it just, that idea is a really scary concept.
Yeah.
And the film does play with that in a very interesting way that does get us to think. And just the fact that it chooses to showcase that perspective is enough to get us talking. And I love that this film exists in this way. I'm not sure if I'm fully in love with it yet, because I'm just trying to understand everything that it's going for. If anything, I do wonder if this experiment it's going for is able to sustain itself for the entire runtime. I'm not sure if it always does, because as a story, it is very repetitive. But I do think Jonathan Glazer, as a filmmaker, is able to do some things that make it ultimately kind of surprising. There are a few formal choices, especially with regard to Mika Levy's harrowing score, which had me worried, because when he's worked with her before, she has a very haunting quality to her compositions that can make films seem more unnerving than they have any right to be, right? But it's not used here in a way that's meant to heighten the dread over the wall. It's used here very sparingly, which is really smart. And I really did appreciate that. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and I was worried that it would, but it doesn't. It's a very minimal score, which I really like. But there is a palpable sense of dread to this movie that Glazer is able to convey throughout the entire runtime for the most part. And I think as an experiment, it is certainly the most fascinating movie I think I've seen this year, even if it's at this point right now maybe not one of my favorites of the year.
Okay, well, I will, I guess, embrace this wholly. This, for me, is absolutely one of the best and most harrowing films of the year. Perhaps what's most impressive, though, is its haunting lucidity. The conceit here isn't sophisticated. Glazer simply exhibits this German Nazi family living their utopian life next door to Auschwitz, all while the horrors of the Holocaust are unfolding as if it's just part of the natural landscape.
Yeah.
And not only does it demonstrate a coarse and inhumane apathy, but a profound, disturbing complicity. It's a spellbinding idea that is viscerally effective. I do agree, Brendan. Not just because of what we see, but primarily because of what Glazer chooses not to show us. The film never goes inside the walls of Auschwitz, as you're also alluding to there. There are times we see the living quarters from the Haas's backyard. We constantly hear gunshots and screaming. We see the flames from the furnaces in the distance at night. However, these are all things in the backdrop. They're wholly normalized to this family, which is almost hard to fathom when you look at it from an omniscient point of view. But that's why it's so distressing. Sometimes less really is more. And I deeply admire films like Schindler's List or Son of Saul, who want to depict the atrocity firsthand and showcase its abominable actions. Those are very good movies, very good movies. Sometimes, though, it's more chilling when it's unseen, when we're forced to imagine why we're hearing agonizing screams in the first place. And there's something about that juxtaposition here of concealed violence and the unflinching lives of the Haas family that is absolutely jarring, especially for Rudolph and Hedwig, for reasons I'm sure we'll get into more as this conversation goes. Their unnerving normalcy in this film is just something you can't wrap your mind around. And Glazer's complete and masterful control over that duality in this film is nothing short of sublime. It is breathtaking to watch, and not enough can be said about Mika Levy's score and how hauntingly it complements everything that we see here as well, for all the reasons you noted. It's limited, but when it's there, it packs a mighty
Yeah.
punch. That is for
Yeah.
sure. And I love these performances. I do want to talk more about that as well. But yeah, it's a simple concept that I think Glazer utilizes to its best effect.
Mhm.
And while it's not an easy watch, I think it is an incredible work of cinema.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be mined out of this, and it does a really good job not only stimulating conversation, but really trying to challenge what it means to showcase dread and horror in movies these days. And this is a movie that's not going to be for everyone. If anything, for those who are maybe more accustomed to being, I guess, for lack of a better term, spoon-fed violence and horror to them, you might find this rather mild, I guess, because it's not one of those movies that's really building to any kind of epiphany or anything like that. In fact, many of these characters, these lead characters of the Haas family, they really have no arcs. If anything, maybe their quote unquote evil becomes more normalized as the film even goes along, but there's no moment of epiphany between them as if to suggest that what they're doing is wrong or that there is an acknowledgement in that. There's no like sense of hope that it's providing
Yes.
either,
Yeah.
which again, I really appreciate that. It really, it does a good job maintaining those horror qualities, especially when you have scenes that are just merely business meetings between Rudolph and his fellow commandants, right?
Mhm.
There's a meeting where they're talking about the transfer of, I think, 700,000 Jews from Hungary, and they carry it out like a
Mhm.
business meeting, a casual conversation of what they're going to do, and they're
Yep.
going to kill them. It's a simple meeting of, it's a procedural scene, really, about how they're
Yeah.
going to kill people. That's basically
Mhm.
what it is, but it is so normalized. In fact, it kind of reminded me a little bit of that one scene from Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, of the perspective of bombing Hiroshima and the fact that they chose a certain location simply because that one general went on his honeymoon there and wanted to preserve
Mhm.
it. Like just the mere passivity in that perspective is more or less the entirety of this movie.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think Glazer does a really great job stimulating that kind of conversation and how like sometimes evil itself is
Yeah.
it's manifested in such a way that it sometimes goes unnoticed, and that's the
Yeah.
scariest part. It's like it's almost like a ghost in some ways, and it's
Yeah.
really interesting.
No, I completely agree. The way this film demonstrates the banality of evil, and not even just that, the brazen disregard of it
Yeah.
is remarkably chilling. I think that's what's so invigorating. Maybe that's the wrong word, but what's so compelling
Mhm.
here about the screenplay and the direction from Glazer, because for many of the reasons you're talking about there, everything unfolds with this organic authenticity. The film takes its time in establishing roles and
Yeah.
giving the audience information. It isn't spoon feeding or reliant on exposition in any way. I
Mhm.
also love how committed it is to its central conceit. There never
Yeah.
is a moment here, and this is what you were very much getting to there as well. There's never a moment in this film where a character wavers on their convictions.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
film never gets caught up in tropes or traps that would humanize the Jews to the Haas family. All of the film's
Mhm.
conflict is centered around Rudolph being reassigned and how that sparks frustration with Hedwig. That's it. That's
Yeah.
all the conflict we get in this film.
That's narrative
Yeah.
conflict here.
There's a moment where, as a result of her anger and fear that they might have to leave, where she berates a maid over, I believe it was spilled water on the floor. And
Yeah.
that's the only overt hostility we see on camera here.
Mhm.
Mostly what we see is the banality of their day to day lives. The screenplay, again, goes out of its way to show us that. In another context, Hedwig's love
Yeah.
for her family might have been affable. Same with Rudolph as well.
Well, and that's
They're-
the interesting thing. Yeah, it's like the love they have for each other and their family. It's still real. Like there is something
Mhm.
genuine about that. Just taking the familial dynamics in a vacuum. There's nothing wrong with them as a family. They're just terrible people in a terrible situation.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting dichotomy of choosing to portray this film from this perspective, because Glazer is showing us that they're human, but he's not trying to humanize them, and that's a
Yes.
really interesting dichotomy there.
I completely agree. And I love that Glazer doesn't emphasize that irony. It's
Yeah.
certainly obvious. As I noted in my opening thoughts, there's nothing
Mhm.
sophisticated about this film.
Yeah.
We do see that there are some wedges within the relationship between Rudolph and Hedwig, not dissimilar
Yeah.
from any other couple, but
Right.
mostly their relationship is cordial.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, of course, the point, because it all comes
Yeah.
back to their casual indifference toward the murder that is taking place. But yes, and with what we see and how each of them, not just together, but individually, how they not only treat their relationship cordially, but the genuine love and care they have for their home and for their
Yeah.
kids and wanting the best for them. Again, in another context, there is something that we could attain from that we could
sure.
relate
Yeah.
with. But I love how Glazer never really emphasizes that irony. It just shows it. And that's what's so important, I think, about his direction here and how he uses the camera so dispassionately. The camera mostly observes. It's almost surveillance.
Yeah.
Like, there are no close-ups in this film, and close-up is a tactic that filmmakers use in order to convey emotion, to convey humanity. We'll talk about that quite a bit with Michael Mann here in the next review.
Very different approaches. Yeah.
Because that's a big part of Ferrari. However, this is a film that doesn't use close-up. It doesn't use those technical techniques in order to convey traditional or conventional emotion. A lot of the time, when we're in the house, and Glazer has talked about this, he set up 5, 6, 7 different cameras, maybe even more than that, around the house in order for him to shoot things as it unfolded.
Yeah.
And it allows these actors to simply organically, again, going back to just the grounded authenticity of this film, just be in the moment with their characters while simultaneously shooting several scenes in different locations at the same time in order to convey that authenticity all the more. The normalcy, how these actors, rather these characters anyway, how they can find themselves fitted all kind of nice and neatly into this cozy setting despite the horrors happening around them. And that's what's interesting is we see these characters running in the backyard, or they're having a picnic down by the river.
Yeah.
Or, dinner in the living room, whatever the case may be. They're doing this all while in the background, the sound design of this film is immaculate. We are hearing what is happening right next door. And so these characters have to actively push beyond the screams and the haunting quality that defines this setting.
Yeah.
And again, I love how Glazer simply presents it almost dispassionately. And, you couple that camera work and that approach to this film from a technical perspective with the screenplay and how he lets everything unfold organically. And to me, that it lays the groundwork for some of the details of this film to really come through in an extremely vivid way.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if those sounds were even present while filming the movie in order to actually force the actors in a state of realism in some way, or if they were added in post-production. And one thing Glazer does that I think is really wise is that he doesn't suffocate the movie in those sounds. They're actually kind of quiet. In many ways, you almost have to try and listen for them to figure out exactly what's happening. There are times you'll hear someone screaming in the background, which implies that someone is being killed in Auschwitz right now. But it's sometimes hard to tell, is that just a bird or is that someone screaming? It's like the way it mixes with natural diegetic sound almost makes it seem like it's putting us in a state of normalcy with this family and makes it even more harrowing then too. So I found that really interesting. And I don't know if that was the intent. Could have just been the quality of sound that I heard this movie in, watching it in my situation and not in a theater, which honestly, I would love to see this in a theater. I would love to see how it's actually mixed in a theatrical setting, because I think it might even be better in that setting there. And I love what you're saying about the way that the film is shot, because nearly every conversation in this movie is a complete disregard of the traditional 180-degree rule, right? When like the way that characters talk to each other and how edits happen. Really, the only conversation we see in this movie that maybe feels the most, I guess, typical in movie form is between Rudolph and Hedwig on the lake there, on the I guess it's the pier or something like that, when she brings the suggestion that if he's about to be transferred, our family should stay here. That's probably the only conversation that feels like it has some traditional movie characteristics, which is fine. It's not a bad thing. It's just that's the only one I can think of it, a movie that's chock full of dialogue and conversations.
But
So
even that one is shot from a distance, like
It
almost
is.
from the side.
It
it's
is.
rare in that moment where they're in front, where we can see them, like where they're facing the camera in a conventional way. That might happen because of how he let these actors be in the moment, where in one moment they're facing the water and then they might turn around to face the character. And by doing that, they accidentally move toward the camera.
Well,
but
that's
but that would be an accidental way of doing that. Mostly the camera is at a distance and just observing the moment.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, I think that is the one moment that maybe needs to play by the rules a little bit more, because it's the one moment when these performances actually need to show a little bit more range, and that needs to be captured.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, and I think Glazer and these two actors do a great job capturing at least some emotionality in that moment where it's needed, because in some ways this film almost feels emotionless. Like, it does have a sense of apathy throughout, and that's ultimately the point. Like the mere idea that Hedwig, played by Sandra Holler here, like the idea that she, on one hand, wants what's best for her family, so she comes up with this suggestion that the family should stay at this home that they've built for themselves just next to Auschwitz. But the fact that she also sees it as a kind of paradise for her family is such a scary idea. And it's so well conceived and so well communicated, especially in Sandra Holler's performance.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think that's what makes Hedwig one of the more, I don't even know how to describe it, one of the more mesmerizing characters of the year, or that we've seen in recent years even, because she displays a level of apathy and disregard that I'm not sure we've seen before. And perhaps that's hyperbolic, but my God, she's almost unrivaled. It's one thing to exhibit detachment because of her political, cultural, or maybe even religious beliefs. However, that's not even the worst of it. At one point in this film, her mother comes to visit, and she gives her a tour of the house and garden and the entire ranch they live on there. And she's extremely proud of it all. She acts, to your point, she acts as if it's some sort of utopia they've created for themselves, which is why, and we've noted this already as well, when Rudolph is given the order to transfer, she is immensely threatened and feeling indignant. And she fights for her home, which leads us to that scene there on the dock where she tells Rudolph that she's not leaving because this is, quote unquote, beyond what we dreamed of.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what she tells him there on the dock. She forces him to leave on his own, and they're just going to wait there for him. We're not leaving Auschwitz. You have to leave. We're staying here. It's incredible. She's so in love with her fantasy that she's not going to let go of it, despite what's happening around her, literally next door, and how she actively has to push beyond that. But I think it even goes further than that. It's not as if she's disturbed by it and has to move past it. She has just rationalized and utterly denied what the truth is. Yeah. From a broad perspective. Like she's completely gone in that regard. There's no moral debate to be had, no ethical debate to be had. But that irony here and how Sandra Huller taps into that, again, in a very organic, authentic way, is disturbing on levels that's almost hard to describe.
Yeah, and then there are at least one or two exchanges she has with their servants that make her perhaps the most frightening villain of the entire year. There's one exchange I don't even know if I want to quote it because it's so shocking. I want people to experience it firsthand.
Oh yes, I know which one you're talking about.
It's the ashes comment, right? Is that the one you're thinking of too? Yeah. But the way she says it so commandingly, but also kind of passively, as if it's like a it's a normal how dare you to someone in their world. That's all it is. But but in our world, knowing the history and how evil that this was and how times have changed for the better in that regard, it's a form of torture, is what that
Yeah.
is. It's a murderous threat. But like she conveys it in
Mhm.
such a frightening way. Like I almost had, that's the one moment where I thought, okay, I have to pause the movie and catch my breath. I was almost left speechless by that moment, and it's just one line of dialogue.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's jaw dropping.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is shocking in a way that isn't meant to create some sort of cheap thrill. It's,
hmm
again, organic to the moment. It's how someone who is so succumbed to the inhumane apathy that would
yeah,
that would come out of a
Wh-
situation like this.
yeah,
That's
and
where
the
it's most cathartic in
and
her.
and and the way it rubs off on the children, like I said earlier, the fact that they're almost being groomed to feel the same way, as if this form of evil doesn't even phase them. Like, I hate making movie comparisons because I already did one with Oppenheimer already during this
Mhm.
conversation, but the way that the children are unfazed by this sort of reminded me a little bit of remember the Michael Haneke film The White Ribbon,
Mhm.
which in some ways was about like the youthful perspective of the birth of Nazism in some way. Like, I feel like that's almost what that movie was getting at. And we kind of see that a little bit here as well. Like the children are so unfazed by what's going on. One kid just simply playing in his bedroom hears something terrible happen outside the house, which we don't see, but he takes a look at it and just kind of mirrors it as if he's like playing the role of the Nazi officer committing these acts. And it's a really harrowing thing when you look at it from that perspective as well. And Glazer does a good job actually
Mhm.
choosing to showcase that to us. Like, it's such an interesting experiment because like we're so used to being fed violence and horror in a way that's literal and tangible. And here he does it in such a new way that it almost raises this conversation on how you can actually do it in movies nowadays.
Mm.
Like there are different ways and different methods and different reasons for doing it. We're going to talk about Michael Mann's Ferrari later this week, right? And he
Yeah.
does something similar in a very different way, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. But it has a purpose for it. But here, Glazer's more or less doing the opposite, and it's
Yeah.
such an interesting choice.
It is. No, I completely agree. And again, I love how observational the camera
hmm
work is here, how Glazer approaches this material as pragmatically as he can to elicit just how deeply immersed these characters were in their
hmm
apathy, and how that funnels through into these kids is all the more alarming. I completely agree. The way they
Yeah.
channel play and pretend through their father's work, how that comes through again through normalcy is chilling,
It
absolutely
is.
chilling.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
certainly speaks to how, and I know we've talked about this before on the show in other reviews. I certainly see this in my kids' life as well, how they really are a blank slate.
Yeah,
It's
they are.
what you imprint onto them, how they channel the world around them.
Mhm.
And that comes through here in these kids who you could argue innocently, because they don't know the broader context of what's happening.
No.
They're just being a child. They're playing, they're
Yeah.
having fun. They
Yeah.
don't know the horrors that is happening around them. And you certainly look at Rudolph and Hedwig and even more disturbing light when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
look at it from that perspective. We talked about Hedwig and the level of apathy and disregard in that character. I
Yeah.
think what's interesting about Rudolph, he's almost arguably more tricky for me to pin down in some ways. As much as I admire Sandra Huller and she's
Yeah.
really great in this film, the duality in Rudolph and how Christian Fidel taps into that here is incredible to me. Again, sometimes it's hard
Mhm.
for me to figure out the words to articulate it, because Glazer and Friedel do a remarkable job of grounding him.
Yeah.
He's one of the worst offenders of the Holocaust,
For
one
sure.
of the very worst. And that certainly comes through at times when he's giving directives and, to your point earlier, having meetings about chamber mechanics. Or in
Mhm.
one scene, he talks about how he was at this party and envisioned how he would gas the entire room instead of joining in on the celebration.
Yeah.
There's no denying his vile behavior. But at the same time, throughout a lot of this film, he is a loving father. I think of those scenes at night when he's reading bedtime stories to his kids. He respects and loves his comrades. There's a moment here where in a vacuum, you'd almost call it endearing and poignant. But there's a moment here where he shows a deep reverence and love to his horse.
For sure.
Animal that he really admires.
And that horse reciprocates that love. It's actually a really tender moment.
Exactly. It's a phenomenal sleight of hand in this film because most of what we see is an army officer who loves his family and his home and isn't dissimilar from anyone else until you add in the context of who he really is.
Yeah.
It's a duality that is executed to perfection. It is tricky. And again, I don't think the film is giving the character empathy. I don't. I think what it's doing is trying to showcase the disparity, like the extremes of humanity, in the sense that from a father perspective, from someone who has a family to take care of, or who has, a family pet or an animal that they love, like everyone can relate to that in some ways. And he does take care of his kids. It's not just the moment when he's reading bedtime stories to his kids. He's, down on the riverbank, playing with them in the water as well. Like, again, in a vacuum, he does things here that you wouldn't think much of him otherwise until we see him in those boardrooms in the meetings and how he's thinking about gassing people. And there's some moments at the end of this film that are chilling and harrowing as well. Like, to showcase those two extremes here is just incredible to me. Like it just, again, I'm struggling to find the words to articulate because I don't know how to really have this discussion.
Well, and I feel like you'll have different interpretations of that character the more you watch this film and think about it, right? I think there'll be more layers to uncover because those dualities certainly exist. And in the case of him saying things like, I thought about how I would gas this room and kill these people. To him, like, yes, that's an evil act, but he doesn't recognize the evil nature of that. To him, it's part of the job in some ways. It's almost like if a civil engineer who builds big bridges were to think about designing one that would collapse and kill people. That's more or less the same thing because it's their way of trying to make sure they do the job right. And it's more or less he's looking at it from a procedural and tactical way for how he's going to do his job. To him, it's just a job. It's more or less just an engineer.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the frightening thing about that, which is why there's really no nuance to the evil there, even if he doesn't recognize it.
No, there's no nuance to the evil. It's mostly the irony within that polarity of the character.
Yeah. Where it gets interesting for me, and you sort of alluded to this, and I don't want to give it away, but there are some final moments involving him on a stairway, I'll simply say.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure what it means yet. If anything, it's the one moment where it seems like Glazer could be suggesting some type of emotional release from him, some type of recognition, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think if anything, it could be more of just the job stress getting to him, if anything else. But like it's a moment where again, I don't really know what it means, but it's fascinating to see a different side of this character kind of reacting a little bit differently for once.
Okay, so my interpretation of the moment is that it's as if he is wrestling with his legacy directly.
Okay.
The reason I come to that, and this is where the editing is just absolutely wonderful, because he comes down the stairs and he has, there's almost this sickening feeling to the character.
Yeah.
And, seemingly out of nowhere, right? Because he's, from what we can tell, perfectly healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But he has this sickening moment, and I love the shot, the corridor shot, where the camera is at the end of the corridor. He's simply standing there at the top of the stairs, and in the background is nothing but that
Yeah.
void from under the skin, just that black
Oh yeah.
abyss.
Oh yeah. I was half expecting Scarlett Johansson to walk out.
I know. It's an incredible, incredible shot. And then there's an edit, and I won't get into the details of what we see after the edit. But
Mhm.
I love the perspective change because it gives weight to his choices, to his actions, his vile, capital V, vile behavior. And then it cuts back to him. And his reaction there, when we cut back to him, I think is astounding because, again, it comes
Yeah.
back to how someone can be so complicit. And
Yeah.
to what you were saying there just a moment ago, not just complicit, but almost aggressively so.
Yeah.
Or at least he's so dispassionate. Like his humanism is so devoid that he's willing to approach it with no emotion whatsoever. There's nothing that will stop him from achieving his goals because his humanity is all but gone.
Yeah.
That I think comes through in a very interesting way there in the end. So like that perspective change, I think adds context and weight to the character in that regard. That's at least that's what I think Glazer is going for there. And I
think it's
find it
yeah.
one of the best moments of the year.
Well, I think that's what makes the ending so fascinating because you can look at it as a way to support Rudolph as a character and what he is going through in that scene. But you can also look at it more, not superficially, but in a more broader way, I guess, about what it means to preserve history and the importance of that.
That
And
too? Sure.
yeah. So when these things happen, these things should not be forgotten. That's ultimately the point of history. And this whole movie is about how these atrocities are treated so banally that you would probably forget about it in time, right? It's part of a normal way of life. So the ending suggests that we shouldn't forget about these things. So if you look at it in a broad term, it works in that way. But to your point, it also works in the context of Rudolph and that legacy that he's grappling with as well.
Yeah, I don't think those two things are all that disassociated.
No, they're not mutually exclusive. You're right.
You know, I think him wrestling with his legacy there in an almost direct way, I think it very much tethers to the importance of why we have to remember, you know, those kinds of atrocities.
Yeah.
And again, it gives further context and perspective that while we might recognize it in this deeply emotional, cathartic way, it's so inherent to our humanity to see these things and be revolted by them.
For
and
sure.
Then you juxtapose that to how we see Rudolph in this film.
Yeah.
Who is anything but those things.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's so interesting. And I have to say, JD, I came into this movie liking it for sure, but I am liking it more with this conversation because there's still a lot I need to mine from it. We haven't even talked about the one perspective shift that happens midway through the film. There's another family we meet for only 2 scenes, and that's basically it. And even the visual of the film kind of changes. It depicts nighttime in a very negative way, literally a film negative way. And I think a lot of that is just to visualize what we actually see at nighttime, so we can actually get a sense of what's going on. But it gives it a very ghostly quality, as if it's suggesting the inevitability of death in this world. And the dangers around that. It's probably the closest moment where this film maybe becomes a traditional war thriller for a moment, because you always feel like something's about to happen. But I love that for a moment it changes the perspective to show the dangers and the horrors from those on the other side, I'll simply say. And in some ways the bravery for some of them too, who didn't have to go through it very literally. Like it adds another layer. It almost seemingly comes out of nowhere. It's a very jarring edit. But I like that he chose to depict it here because it gets us talking, and it gets us talking about that perspective as well.
So what's interesting about his use of thermal imaging, and that's what you're referring to. There's a couple of times here where it shifts to thermal imaging to showcase other characters who are involved on the fringes of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And it does give us a little bit of a perspective shift. What's also fascinating there, those moments come at the time when Rudolph is reading those bedtime stories to his kids.
Yeah, and is he
So
reading Hansel and Gretel or something like that? I
I
think that's
think
one of them.
that's what
Yeah,
it is. Yeah, if I recall what it correctly there.
yeah,
But yeah, I found that irony fascinating, and it reminded me of. I think it is a little reminiscent of Spielberg and
sure.
Schindler's List. The use
Yeah,
of
I was
color in that
I,
film,
I
the
was
thermal
I was thinking of the red
imaging.
jacket scene. Yeah.
Yeah, the thermal imaging in this film is almost symbolically doing the same things as the red jacket.
Hmm.
And I guess I don't want to get into it in too much detail, but like
Yeah, I'm with you.
similarly to what Spielberg does with the red jacket, I think that's exactly what Glazer is doing here with the thermal imaging and some of the feelings that can come out of it,
Hmm.
which I think are wonderfully jarring. It's jarring
Yeah.
in a great way because so much of the inhumanity of the Haas family, it's so bleak
Hmm.
that when these thermal images come and it renders something that is antithetical to that
Hmm.
hopelessness,
Hmm.
you can't help but feel, or at least I couldn't help but feel emotionally overwhelmed almost because
Yeah,
it's
you're
such
right.
a,
It is kind of a release
it is.
in many ways. So it's almost a trick in some ways. So because I think without something like this, the film would almost slowly turn into evil white noise if there
Yeah.
were ever a thing, and it almost would run the risk of I guess normalizing that evil so much that we wouldn't even recognize it anymore.
Mhm.
And so in some ways you almost need to have something like this happen to at least ground the audience and recognize the right and wrong of this, because that is a
Yeah.
moral responsibility for Glazer as a filmmaker depicting this
Mhm.
story, and I'm glad that he still chooses to do that.
Yeah, I agree, and I love how symbolically it kind of taps into the overall coarseness of the film in the sense
Hmm.
that these sequences take place at night, hence the thermal
Yeah.
imaging, and as if to say that the darkness is so overwhelming that
Hmm.
you know like what these characters are partaking in there, the dangers are so high that if they're caught, it's only going to add more
Well,
to that bleakness.
it makes it look like there's always some watchful eye on this individual, right?
Yeah.
This individual, when thermal imaging is employed here, and for those who don't know what thermal imaging is, it almost looks like night vision. Essentially,
Yeah.
it's kind of similar to that, but it almost makes it look like she's always being watched. The she in question here, this specific character, who I won't really say, just for the
Mhm.
for the sheer narrative to work, I think you need to go into it and kind of be surprised by this shift. And also, I like that these shifts are here, not just that they're jarring, which is interesting, but I think without them, the film definitely would have lost some sustain in its central conceit, right? Like there are times where I did think to myself, does this conceit sustain itself for the entire runtime? But having these jarring moments do shift the trajectory of the movie a little bit to allow
Mhm.
for some, I don't want to say excitement, but it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah.
So then when it pulls back to the Haas family, we get back to that central conceit. It's almost like we're being reintroduced to it again.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
actually really good editing and really good storytelling in that regard.
I agree. I don't think that the film I don't think it overstays its welcome because of how it
Okay.
builds to these things.
Hmm.
And there are a couple of times where it does get jarring in a really great way. I mean, the film opens up with us at the Haas family, and there's a lot in those opening scenes we don't know. As I noted earlier, the film takes its time in relaying information.
Hmm.
So we're 15, 20 minutes into the movie before we start to realize, okay, this is who these characters are. This is their involvement. Rudolph is the commandant, because unless you read
Yeah.
that synopsis, you don't really know that until about 20 minutes into the movie.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
You might not even know when this takes place until about 20 minutes into the movie.
exactly. And then we start to build on things a little bit. There's
Yeah.
the moment of the kids in the water and the ashes,
Sure. Sure.
kind of floating there. And and Rudolph has to take them. And so we get that moment. And then the grandma character shows up. And we have to talk about that moment, right? Because not only is she introduced, I mentioned earlier that Hedwig shows her around and talks about how it's this utopia. We've finally found this perfect living situation, which is, you hear it, and I'm getting chills now just hearing myself reiterate what she's saying, because it's like, so insane.
This is such a paradise, right? There's murder next door.
There's murder next door. But yes, so there's that moment. And even there, like, her mom's reaction isn't necessarily, she's not enthralled. We'll just put it that way.
Sure.
And then there comes a moment about halfway through this film where, if you want to say the perspective shifts a little bit, I do think it does so. This takes place at night. There's a visual that clearly disturbs the grandma character. And it's the only moment in the film where Glazer, I think, is saying something a little pointedly in terms of the morals of, or the morals of what's at play here.
Yeah.
And it's one of the best scenes of the film as well, and maybe one of the best scenes of the year. I think that is a really incredible moment here as well. And then after that, there's the building of, okay, well, Rudolph might be reassigned. How is that going to threaten our home? And then he does leave. How does that change things a little bit? You throw in a little bit of Rudolph's affairs, which, you know, they allude to early on, and then it comes to fruition in a much more overt way later on in the film.
For sure.
So
for sure.
the film, it's not as if it's just constantly the film in their day-to-day lives. I mean, it is a lot of that for sure, but I think the film builds on itself in a great way while throwing in these jarring moments, such as the grandma witnessing and having this epiphany, or the thermal imaging moments. And then what we get at the end, where there's another perspective shift and with Rudolph and what he's having to wrestle with is in terms of his legacy. And then the film ends. So like, it's like, I don't think that the film overstays its welcome or overly emphasizes its central conceit and ironies.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. I think what's interesting about the grandma character is, it might be the moment that, as you say, could be the most quote unquote pointed thematically and emotionally in the film. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's neat to have that perspective shift that's very different from the other German people, right? But I think what's interesting about the grandma, at least this is something I picked up on when she and her daughter are going through the garden and the backyard and kind of experiencing the joys and the comfort of this home. I think the grandma makes some type of passing comment that one of her old friends, who apparently is Jewish, might be over the wall right now dying. And she's like, oh, well, I guess that's what it is. And it's almost like she's like forcibly trying to save face a little bit. Like she's trying to, I guess, blend in, for lack of a better phrase, right? Until what she sees out the window shows her the true nature of how she really feels about this. And I think that's kind of interesting to make you think that how many people, how many German people, how many Nazi people actually did feel this way. Like they didn't fully believe
that had those moments of epiphany.
That they didn't really believe in what they were representing, but they were kind of forced to, right? It's interesting.
And by comparison, gives more weight to the complete disregard and the banality within the actions of Hedwig and Rudolph.
Exactly.
Like the film goes out of its way to demonstrate that, not in a redundant way. At least I didn't find it redundant, but in a way that compounds on itself as the film goes. Like the thermal imaging moments, I don't think are saying the same things as the grandma moment. Or if they are kind of on the same plane, they're doing it in different ways that I think are visually very, very interesting, dramatically very interesting, performatively as well. And that, I think, keeps the film from feeling stale. At least I would argue so.
Yeah, and when I say I wasn't sure if the film's central conceit is able to sustain itself for its entire runtime, I don't think it ever becomes stale either. If this movie were 10 minutes longer, I think it could have become stale. But it is.
It ends at the right time.
It does end at the right time. The movie is if I'm not mistaken, like 102 minutes or something like that. It's under 2 hours. Well, it's, I mean, an hour and 45 minutes according to IMDb as I look at this. But
Yeah,
that
105.
yeah, but that includes a lengthy title card that goes on for what, 5 minutes and a black screen of music. So it kind of has that, what's it, that, like that 2001: A Space Odyssey opening where it's just black and musical for a while until the movie actually begins.
You're wondering, is there something wrong with the film?
Yeah, I thought about
You're
that
not
too.
sure what's happening.
Yeah, if you watch
same
the
thing with the, like, I thought the same thing with that edit at the end we talked about with Rudolph there on the stairs, and then there's an edit that gives us a complete perspective shift. I had to rewind the film to be like, is that purposeful? Is there something wrong?
I thought like
the movie?
like if I had an old VHS tape or something like that, it was badly spliced together or something. There's another moment. There's another moment midway through. I think it's when it's showing these beautiful flowers, juxtaposing that beauty with the horroring sounds over the wall at Auschwitz, which is a great sequence already. But it slowly becomes red. Like the whole screen turns red, and then as it's red, the music swells up, and then out of nowhere, it just edits back to the banalities of day-to-day life. I actually thought it was a mistake. I thought there was some type of mistake there, but it keeps you on your toes. It keeps you on your toes for sure.
It does, and then you couple that with, as we noted earlier, Glazer's direction. I did look it up. Yeah. I underestimated the amount of cameras. The film is shot with 10 fixed cameras in the house. So the actors can walk around freely. They can have an open dialogue to make the film all the more realistic. And as I noted earlier, Glazer would shoot overlapping scenes at the same time and with the same diegetic light for consistency. And I love that approach here. I think it wonderfully gives the film a lived-in aesthetic, one that complements the Haas's complicity and makes sense of why they feel at home there. And I think it keeps the characters at a distance at the same time.
For sure, yeah. And I love the way that it's almost a bit desaturated as well. It's not the most colorful of movies, so it does, it does make everything blend in better, not just because it is natural, as you're saying, but it is kind of a, dare I say, kind of a drab-looking movie, as it should be, right? Like, this is a place where things are dying. People are dying, so it's meant to look like that.
Yeah, it's drab, but also there's, and I do think this is purposeful as well, when we're getting these more wide shots of the landscape, there is a beauty to the area, such as that opening scene when they're there a little ways away from the water.
Yeah.
And in any other context, you'd look at that moment and go, man, this is such a beautiful area. Look at how gorgeous the landscape is. You have this family together. There's a brand new little baby boy right there. How adorable is that? Like, it does feel utopia-like in that opening scene. And that is clearly there to be subverted immediately afterwards. So
it gets you to think, oh, this is beautiful. I want to visit this place. Oh, nope, never mind.
Yeah, well, and that's what I love about the filmmaking here, because yes, the garden is gorgeous. They have this, in-ground pool even. It's a place where all the kids from the entire area can come over and play.
They even have a slide in the pool.
They have a slide, and it's this wide open area. There's a nice house, you can come over and eat, it really is a nice setting. But throughout the film, while the camera is, again, it's not giving attention to these things, but as the camera will move with the characters or show us various parts of the backyard, what do we see in the background? Well, we see the smoking stacks. We see the living quarters there that are looking utterly dilapidated. You couple that with the sounds and the screams and the gunshots, everything that we're hearing. At one point, there's a train that just rolls by in the background. We know what that is.
Yep.
And that all adds to the horror, juxtaposed to the beauty of the actual home.
Sure.
And that sounds simple, and it is a simple irony, I guess. But I do love how that is executed here, because that irony
it's how it makes
constant.
you feel. Yeah,
It's how it adds to the dread, And the reason I think it's effective is because of the details. There's a lot of little details that Glazer throws in here. And also, he never calls attention to any of it. It's just there. It's just something we see and it's something we feel. If he calls attention to anything, it's the sound work.
Yeah.
He wants us to never lose sight of where this is taking place. So we're constantly hearing screams. We're constantly hearing the furnaces, gunshots all over. Like at a certain point, you do come a little numb to the gunshots.
You do.
And that's almost a terrifying feeling.
Yeah. If anything, he's kind of bringing those banalities to us. Like I said, I think I said this earlier in this conversation, that it's almost like he's turning us into these same complicit individuals. And it just goes to show how easily manipulated we can be when evil's all around us, right?
Yeah.
That's a scary thought. That's a scary thought. Glazer, you madman.
It's incredible. And I also want to give credit to Sandra Hüller and Christian Friedel as well, because
good performances.
They give very committed performances here. They tap into that banality. They tap into that ideal of utopia extremely well. The love they have for their kids. I always go back to that freaking moment with Rudolph and that moment with his horse. I don't know why I find it so striking, because in any other context, like if he was not a German soldier, army officer, and one of the worst offenders of the Holocaust, if he was on the other side, let's say he was a British soldier and it's Warhorse and not the Zone of Interest, you look at that and go, man, that's so good. Like I'm with you. I love horses too. Especially war horses, and that's what he is. He's a war horse.
Horse, underrated Spielberg
movie. Yes, you look at that and go, man, that is a human moment. And then you add in everything else around Rudolph, and you go, this guy is not human, except the horses. He's more human to horses than he is to humans, and that is probably the point of the scene. That's probably why it's there in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also, like I said, I think earlier in this conversation, it's the horse reciprocating that love. So there actually is a tender and almost innocent quality to it. It's like when a dog looks at their owner and has these loving eyes with them, you're instinctually going to respond emotionally to that, right? And I think that's the same case here. You do, but it's the situation and the circumstance around it that makes you question why you're reacting that way in the first place.
Yeah, and I think you could also argue that the love and adoration that he's demonstrating there, yes, it is for this animal, and the irony that he only shows it to the animal outside of his kids. I do want to reiterate, he does show that same love to his kids in this film.
Right.
But he's clearly not showing that to anyone else. But you could also argue that what he's adoring there is power. Because when he's on that horse, when he's mounted on that horse, he's the leader. He's the captain. He's the one barking orders.
He's above everyone else.
He's above everybody else. So what he's really in love with there is with power. So there's a symbolic fortitude to the moment as well.
For sure.
But like Friedel he really goes for it. Utterly committed. Same thing with the ending. Like those reactions he has there at the end on the stairs. Truly stunning work.
It is.
You know?
Yeah. You have to give actors credit for playing the most evil people sometimes and doing it so realistically that it almost makes you think, are you really like this in real life? It's I can see people having that conversation, but they're very committed. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Hell of a year for Sandra Hüller. Hell of a year.
Oh yeah. Between this and Anatomy of a Fall, she has a good shot of getting nominated for both, but I don't think it's going to happen.
No, I don't think it'll happen. She'll likely get in for Anatomy of a Fall. But if she was to miss and get in for supporting, I would understand. Because she really is phenomena here in displaying one of the worst characters we've seen. Morally worst characters.
I can't say which performance is better because they're so different. They're doing such different things.
They're extremely different. Yeah, you can't even compare them really.
Yeah, I'm more emotionally invested in what she's doing in Anatomy of a Fall, but that's a performance that asks for that, right?
Yeah.
So in many ways, it's a more varied performance. It's a more sympathetic performance than this is.
With all of its great areas as well.
Yeah.
You know, there's really not much that is gray with Hedwig. Although,
No.
again, the way she especially loves her family, but even the cordial qualities with the Rudolph character as well, like there's clearly a care there and a genuine love, but it's, you know, a small seed compared to the massive crops that is her apathy and disregard.
Yeah.
And again, how Huller taps into that and these sometimes very subtle, sometimes quite aggressive ways. You noted one of the more appalling moments in the film with Hedwig in this film.
Oh yeah, that's not even an
And-
insult. Like, that is
Yeah,
so
it's-
bad. It's so mean.
Yeah.
It's so mean.
It's so mean. And it all comes back to how defensive she is toward this utopia that she's built
Yeah.
for her and her kids.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
crazy.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
Insane movie.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely
Great
the best
movie.
villain of the year.
Yeah. I love this film. I think it's one of the best of the year.
Okay.
It'll likely be represented at the In Session Film Awards in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, there are definitely qualities that'll probably get nominated for me. At this point now, I don't know if it'll be in my top 10. This is a movie I know I'm going to like more with time. There's still a lot I need to mine from it. I just don't know if I'll get there by the time we do our award show. But I know I'll like it more. At this point now, my favorite Glazer film is still Under the Skin. That one is just such an interesting and harrowing experience in and of itself, but such a different experience. But this one is definitely going to grow on me. I can at least say that.
I'm honestly at a point where I don't know if I can really pick between the two. And I think what's interesting, I want to say I read this on Letterboxd. I can't recall who it was, so forgive me. I can't take credit for it because I read it on Letterboxd.
Yeah.
But someone pointed out that Under the Skin is a movie about an alien, a monster, if you will, that finds this humanity by the end. Where The Zone of Interest is a movie where seemingly humans, that become monsters by the end.
I think
Or
it was
monsters throughout a lot of.
I think it was Scott Tobias who said that on
that
Letterboxd
Scott
because
Tobias?
he made some kind of passing comment how this and Under the Skin are very similar. The only difference is that in Under the Skin, the aliens are at least capable of having change, right? Or
Yeah.
showing change, but not here. So So
This is-
it may have been him in that regard, but I think you're right. I think that's
Yeah.
a really astute observation.
I agree, and I think it's very astute. They are very similar movies in that regard, and
Yeah.
similarly in Under the Skin, there is this, if you want to call it violent, there is a devouring nature to that film.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that does show some death and carnage in a very interesting way, obviously. But yes, the monster becomes human. In this film, the human becomes the monster.
Yeah.
Without showing the
Yeah.
devouring of it all. Like all of
Yeah.
that takes place next door, literally next door, but it's all off screen.
Yeah.
I
I mean, the only time we ever
that
see it,
fascinating.
the only time we ever really see anything is that one scene in the creek that you alluded
Yeah,
to
in the
earlier.
creek.
That's
Yep.
really the
It's
only
the
form of
byproduct of it.
yeah, but it's the only form of physicality we get with regard to the violence.
Yeah, that's it. That's really it. And it's fascinating. This is easily in my top 10. I won't reveal where, but it is there. And I don't see that changing in a few weeks.
All right. Well,
This is easily
I have
one
a
of my
guess.
favorites.
I have a guess of where it might be if you're that confident that it's not going to change.
Okay. We'll see.
It's number
We'll
11.
see. We'll see. Yeah, number 11. We'll see. At any rate, I love this. We have a written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. Let us know. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please rate and review us. It really helps out the show as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that is it. Anything else, Brendan, before we get out of here for this episode?
I do genuinely think the Zone of Interest is a great name for a podcast. I think we need to let that happen. I don't know what the podcast topic would be. It doesn't necessarily have to be movies. It could really just be about anything interesting.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be a spin-off podcast that we do. Maybe we should take credit for, stealing the name for a podcast.
The zone of incession. Yeah, we can do that.
The zone of incession. Yeah. The zone of incession's interest. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
Incession zone. Yeah, I'm sure we can mine a few things from that.
Workshop that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But at any rate, yeah. Zone of interest. Jonathan Glazer, good filmmaker. Any other final thoughts? Was that it?
I do want to see. I'll just say I do want to see it again at some point. I don't know if we'll get a chance.
I have one other final thought.
Okay.
And I am ashamed of myself. I should have mentioned this earlier. But I want to call attention to Mika Levy's score once again.
Yeah, it's
good. It
good.
is absolutely haunting, extremely disturbing. And speaking of the Incession Film Awards, it'll probably be in my 5.
I mean, it might even be nominated at the Oscars. I wouldn't be surprised.
And it might be. I believe it was on the short list, so that's good.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, they left off some others that should be on there, but that's another conversation for another time. At least Mika Levy made the list, and that's great.
Yeah.
It should be. It's and it's one of those things because you're right, Brendan. There's not a lot of score here, but it's extremely effective.
And that's the thing that scared me the most, because there have been times that a Mika Levy score did overstay its welcome for me, but that was more of a directional choice and not a Mika Levy choice. Like a movie like Spencer, for instance, a Pablo Larraín film, I thought was overscored a little too much. But if that were the case here with the Zone of Interest, and the music was meant to emphasize the horrors of what we hear over the wall in Auschwitz, that would have been a big problem. But the film doesn't do that. It's not cheapening the existing thrill there, and I think that's a wise choice.
I agree. Yeah, it's really fantastic work. Yeah, the craft of this film is truly astounding. It's really great.
It's a very interesting movie.
Absolutely. All right. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Jonathan Glazer. Make movies more than once every 9 years.